In my first video, I spoke of the history of the Second Vatican Council and the immediate aftermath of it. In my most recent video in this series, I gave a brief outline of the mainlining of the Traditionalist movement and gave a brief overview of the view of Pope St. John Paul II and that of Pope Benedict XVI concerning the Latin Mass. I also provided a general overview of Traditionis Custodes, as well as the immediate reaction to it, both among Catholic commentators and within the hierarchy. In this video, my third video on Traditionis Custodes, I will provide a few short thoughts on the Pope's recent decree, and what effects I think that will have on the life of the Church. Firstly, I believe Pope Francis's recent decree is an imprudent means of bringing about an understandable end. Pope Francis's intentions are presented in a not-so-subtle manner, and if one has been following Pope Francis's statements on the topic of the Latin Mass and the Traditionalist movement more generally for the past 8 years of his pontificate, it will become evident what Pope Francis's general mindset is. In the letter to the bishops that accompanied Traditionis Custodes, the Pope wrote, and I quote, "At the same time, I am saddened by abuses in the celebration of the liturgy on all sides. In common with Benedict XVI, I deplore the fact that in many places the prescriptions of the new Missal are not observed in celebration, but indeed come to be interpreted as an authorization for, or even a requirement of creativity, which leads to almost unbearable distortions. But I am nonetheless saddened that the instrumental use of the Missale Romanum of 1962 is often characterized by a rejection not only of the liturgical reform, but of the Vatican Council too itself, claiming with unfounded and unsustainable assertions that it betrayed the tradition and the quote-unquote true church. That is to say, the Pope fears certain traditionalists who used the deregulation of the Latin Mass as a mask for ideological radicalism, which manifested itself worst of all in the questioning of Vatican II as a legitimate part of the Church's magisterium. This is in line with other statements Pope Francis has put out concerning the Traditionalist movement. In an on-board interview given while traveling back to Rome during his 2019 visit to Romania, Pope Francis said, quote, "Tradition is the guarantee of the future, and not the keeper of ashes. It is not a museum. Tradition does not preserve ashes. The nostalgia of the fundamentalists is to return to ashes." Unquote. Like with many of Pope Francis's other off-the-cuff statements, this statement is subject to a wide variety of different interpretations. Some of the more liberal theologians within the Church will interpret this as a denial of the fact that there is any consistency to Church teaching, that there is any basis to Church teaching that is eternal and unchanging. Tradition is something that is in constant change and flux, according to such thinkers, and needs to be in order to meet the needs of the times. It is something to be made and remade in accordance with the spirit of the times. The notion that there are certain immutable principles to which we must conform our inner dispositions and outer actions, or certain immutable traditions, or even certain traditions that can change, but which it may not be prudent to change for any reason or under any set of circumstances, is nonsensical to such individuals. Nonetheless, there are some traditionalists who seem to want to defend tradition merely out of a sense of nostalgia or sentimentality towards the past, and to seem to deny that tradition is something living, that is, something that is capable of confronting new sets of moral and spiritual situations. There is also the infamous rigid traditionalists comment also made by Pope Francis. In his 2019 Christmas greeting to the Roman Curia, Pope Francis said, and I quote, "Here there is a need to be wary of the temptation to rigidity, a rigidity born out of a fear of change, which ends up erecting fences and obstacles on the terrain of the common good, turning it into a minefield of incomprehension and hatred. Let us always remember that behind every form of rigidity lies some kind of imbalance. Rigidity and imbalance feed one another in a vicious circle. And today this temptation to rigidity has become very real." Unquote. A lot of traditionalists took offense at this, and rightfully so, claiming that Pope Francis is painting the entire traditionalist movement with an overly broad brush, and has a simplistic, even wrong-headed view on the nature of tradition if he sees the desire to preserve tradition as rigidity. Nonetheless, there are individuals, even within the traditionalist movement, who are fundamentalist in their beliefs and personality. And the temptation to fall into fundamentalism and fanaticism is particularly imminent within traditionalism, which places a strong emphasis on preserving and strictly adhering to tradition. Fanaticism is also a particularly imminent danger in today's world, a time of constant change and rebellion against tradition. No one, not even the most ardent traditionalist, would argue against the fact that fanaticism and fundamentalism are bad things, and that these things are often a perversion of the mentality that gives birth to traditionalism. This was, in fact, part of the reason why more moderate branches of the traditionalist movement emerged. Some feared that groups like the Society of St. Pius X and the Sedevacantists were going too far, endorsing ever more extreme positions, and doing so in such a way so as to undermine the unity of the Church. I would wholeheartedly say that fanaticism, rigidity, schism, rebellion against the magisterium of the Church, which includes Vatican II, and strictly adhering to tradition for no other reason than for the sake of nostalgia are all bad things. I believe, though, on the other hand, that Pope Francis throws the baby out with the bathwater. One common polemical nugget often put forward by traditionalists is something along the lines of, the traditional Latin Mass is the Mass that spiritually formed all the great popes, all the great saints, mystics, artists, and intellectuals of the Western Christian tradition. And that's true. All that is wrong with the traditionalist movement stems from a faulty mindset on the part of individuals within the traditionalist movement. Pope Francis seems to be at least implicitly blaming the traditional Latin Mass itself for the mindset of some of those more radical supporters of it. The traditional Latin Mass laid the basis for the liturgical and spiritual patrimony of the West. Yet in the mind of Pope Francis, and partly because of the words and actions of many traditionalists themselves, the Latin Mass is associated with schism, an insular and overly inward-turning attitude, and fanaticism. Pope Francis is, in a word, placing greater restrictions on that which spiritually nourished 2,000 years of saints, mystics, and theologians on account of those who corrupt this Mass through their negative spiritual attitude. The solution is to try to find a way to reach those who Pope Francis sees as being beyond the pale of mainstream Catholicism and reintegrating them into the Church, rather than restricting or outlawing that which has been the bedrock of Catholic worship for 2,000 years. On a more practical level, I think things are even more complex. On some level, I don't believe Traditionis Custodes will have much of an impact. As of 2020, there were 35,513 Catholic priests in the United States. On the other hand, as of that same year, there were only 330 priests and 12 deacons worldwide associated with the Fraternal Society of St. Peter. In the United States, there are only 168 members of the FSSP, which includes priests, deacons, and seminarians. There are only 57 seminarians associated with the FSSP in the United States as of 2020. Yet, as of 2015, there were 3,650 seminarians in the entire United States. There are only 110 priests and 15 clerical oblates affiliated with the Institute of Christ the King and Sovereign Priest, and that's worldwide, whereas there are just a little under 700 priests affiliated with the Society of St. Pius X as of 2017. And again, these three groups, the ICKSP, the SSPX, and the FSSP, are the three largest orders within the Traditionalist movement. And yet the number of priests and seminarians associated with them is in the dozens and hundreds. In the United States, there are a total of 658 places officially approved by the Church for the celebration of the Latin Mass, and that number is actually on the higher end of the spectrum from an international perspective. Argentina and China have only 4 venues that have been officially approved by the Church for the use of celebrating the Latin Mass. Austria has only 8. Belarus, Colombia, and Denmark have only 2. The Dominican Republic, Hong Kong, and Estonia have only 1. Most nations have more than that. France has just shy of 200. The Czech Republic has 29. Great Britain has 157. Ireland has 20. And Italy has 91. Traditionis Custodes will no doubt take an already tough situation for traditional Catholics and make it even more difficult. But it will not lead to the collapse of a large segment of the Catholic Church. The big impact will not be so much any significant decrease in the number of Latin Mass parishes or the number of priests celebrating the Latin Mass, at least not in terms of raw numbers, since the numbers were not that high to begin with. Rather, the significant thing to focus in on is how the bishops and how the laity respond to or receive the Pope's recent document. I have my doubts that the number of bishops who interpret Traditionis Custodes in a manner that is more generous towards traditionalist Catholics, or who even outright disregard it, will be anything but few. But the fact that so far there are at least some bishops who spoke out against Traditionis Custodes, or who spoke out in favor of the traditional Latin Mass, is a sign of things to come. There will always be at least some people in the upper echelons of the hierarchy, though, again, in today's church, it's most likely to be few and far between, who will publicly take issue with this decree. And this will only serve to intensify an already toxic situation within church politics. And even if the number of bishops and priests who reject or critique Traditionis Custodes increases, that will still cause the situation within the hierarchy to become even more tense and to become even more toxic. The hierarchy of the church is, in some sense, a microcosm of the church more generally. Some people who were previously on the fence between the more moderate and the more radical branches of the traditionalist movement will probably be pushed in the direction of radical traditionalism. Based on the nature of human psychology, the more the Pope tries to restrict the Latin Mass, the more some traditional Catholics will push back. Therefore, Pope Francis's recent decree, instead of causing increased unity within the Church, will probably, at least in the short term, lead to more division, at least among the laity and among Catholic thought leaders. I've seen several prominent online Catholic commentators begin to use certain forms of argumentation normally associated only with the radical traditionalists. Of course, most Catholics will fall into one of three categories. Either one, people who don't really care about what Traditionis Custodes has to say because they're either not practicing Catholics or because they don't really have a problem with the traditional Latin Mass, but they're satisfied with their standard, run-of-the-mill post-Vatican II liturgy. 2. Liberals who actively support Pope Francis's decree. Or 3. Traditionalists who play the game, that is to say, people who try to keep alive the Latin Mass within the ever more restrictive parameters created by Pope Francis. Nonetheless, the radical traditionalists will become much louder and much larger over the course of the next few months and years. How the struggle unfolds and how, or whether, things change depends on a few different factors. How many bishops speak out against Traditionis Custodes, whether in public or in private? Will the immediate backlash to Pope Francis's decree be so strong that it will cause Pope Francis to have a change in heart? If Pope Francis maintains or even intensifies the current liturgical status quo, then things will most likely only change after the election of his successor. Who will succeed Pope Francis as Pope? And what will their theological dispositions be? That will determine whether or not they keep alive or reverse the current track that Pope Francis has started. But all of these are questions that must be kept in mind in order to make sense of how the effects of Traditionis Custodes unfold. It has only been a month since Traditionis Custodes was published, and I would like to do more research on these questions, which will require examining events as they happen. Nonetheless, I would like to end this video series by advising traditionalist Catholics to not get angry and to not lose hope. I understand why traditionalist Catholics take the Latin Mass seriously, and I completely agree that the ordinary and extraordinary forms should coexist within the Church. Nonetheless, the Church has been through hardships of similar or even greater severity in the past, and it will inevitably go through similar situations in the future. Yet as Catholics, we trust that Jesus Christ is protecting the Church, and that he will continue to protect and guide the Church, as he has constantly done so over the course of the past 2,000 years. Thus, traditionalist Catholics should do all that they can within the context of the current situation to preserve the Latin Mass as best as possible. With that in mind, I hope you all enjoyed this video series, and I want to thank you all for tuning in, and God bless.